it's a lesson because it's about a courageous woman who who lays it all on the line for the love of her people, to preserve her people. And Esther, at this time, has become queen of the Persian Empire. Now, Esther, she started out as an orphan child. She was, because her parents died at an early age, and then she was raised by her cousin, Mordecai, who raised her as his own child. But also, learning this here is that then during this time, a wicked man named Haman, the king Ahasuerus appointed him to be second in command. And so he goes to the king, Haman does, and he mislead and deceive the king into thinking that the Jews was a threat to the Persian Empire. And he gets the king to issue a decree that will have all the Jews in the Persian Empire executed. And this was to take place on the 13th day of the 12th month, which was the month of Adar, according to the Jewish calendar. Now, when Mordecai learns of this evil decree that has been issued, he goes into mourning. He put on sackcloth and he goes into mourning. And then when Esther learned that her cousin, who had actually raised her, that he's in sackcloth and mourning, she wants to know why. So she sends someone to investigate. And that brings us to where we begin our lesson today in Esther chapter 4, beginning with verse 6. So Hathach went forth to Mordecai unto the street of the city, which was before the king's gate. And Mordecai told him of all that had happened unto him, and the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay the king's treasuries for the Jews to destroy them. So Mordecai, she sends someone to investigate. And Mordecai tells him what had happened to him. He tells him about the evil decree that had been issued that we would have on the 13th day of the 12th month, we're going to have all the Jews executed. And then it also tells him about the sum of money that they was going to pay, which was about 10,000 talents. And this was because that by executing all the Jews and taking all their possessions, this was going to create a large sum of money. And so the king was okay with that because that would be money for building projects, money for the military. So he was okay with that. But the thing that we see what Esther's doing here is that she's teaching us something here, in that the first thing she does is that she gets understanding. And that should be the first thing we do in all situations, all circumstances, to get understanding. Because see, the true issue here is spiritual warfare, good versus evil. And this is not the first attempt of Satan to destroy God's chosen people. And the same holds true for us. Just like God's chosen people is not immune to Satan's attempt to destroy them, neither are we. We're in a spiritual warfare every day of our lives, and we need to be aware of that. And then look at verse 8. Also, he gave him, that is, Mordecai gave to Hathach a copy of the writing of the decree that was given at Shushan to destroy them. Now, what he does here is he provides proof. He provides facts. So to make sure that Esther understands that there'll be no misunderstanding and that it's not just hearsay, Mordecai, he provided a written copy, facts. And then he said, and to show it unto Esther. And then to declare it unto her, that means to explain it to her. And then he also listed some instructions here. And notice what he said, and charge her. That is to urge her, to implore her. It essentially means to issue a command, that command her to go into the king. And then it says, and to make supplications. That is to make intercessory, to plead for mercy here. And then she says, and to make a request before him for her people. Now, the reason why he issued these instructions is because in that Persian culture, once the king issued a decree and it was signed, it was irrevocable and it couldn't even be changed, not even by the king himself. So the supplication was to plead for mercy here, and then to make a request that an additional covenant, an additional decree could be issued. Now, We can learn from this right here. I want you to see something here. Now, notice that the first thing Esther does is that she wants to get understanding. Then they provide facts. Now, why is this important? Now, this is important to us because when Haman went to King Ahasuerus, he didn't get understanding and he didn't get the facts. He was misled and he was deceived into issuing a decree that would have all the Jews executed, not knowing at this time that the queen herself was a Jew. And so that's why it's so important to get understanding and to get facts, because that way we won't be misled and we will not be deceived. And because, remember, every day of our lives we are in a spiritual battle for control of our minds. And notice at verse 9, and Hathach came and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Verse 10, and again Esther spoke unto Hathach and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. Now notice how this dialogue, now beginning with verse 9 here, you're going to see just a beautiful example of how we should conduct ourselves in situations. And how we should conduct ourselves when we find ourselves in a situation that seems helpless and hopeless. And because because remember, this is spiritual warfare. And the idea here is this: the reason why you want to get understanding, you want to get facts, because how can two walk together unless they agree? How can two walk together unless they understand the other's point of view? That's why it's so important to get understanding and to get facts, because we're in a spiritual warfare. And so notice how they came and told Esther what Mordecai said. Now Esther's going to respond to Mordecai. Let's say this is a beautiful example of how we should conduct ourselves when we find ourselves in these situations. Notice in verse 11 how Esther responds back to Mordecai. Now remember in verse 8, Mordecai had told Esther to go before the king. Now she's going to respond back. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces. And now there's 127 provinces in the Persian Empire. That's like saying today there's 159 counties in the state of Georgia. So it was the whole Persian Empire here, 127 provinces. Do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king, unto the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his, to put him to death, except to such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. Now, we can learn from what Esther is saying here, because now notice, no one could go before the king unless they were sworn. If this, it was instant death. You were taking your life to your own hand, because they didn't know what your intentions were. They didn't know whether you were trying to execute the king or what the case may be. So like you couldn't just go before the king unless you were sworn. But that's a lesson here for us to learn. And it's this: we are not immune to the laws of society, nor its consequences. Esther's fears were real. Our fears are real. But we overcome our fears by trusting in God. See, Satan wants us to fear our circumstances more than we trust God. And so, remember, this is spiritual warfare. This is spiritual warfare, and we have to keep in mind every day of our lives that we have to be aware of that, and we don't want to be misled. We don't want to be deceived, and that's why we want to get facts. We want to get understanding. And so, like I said, this is a beautiful example how they communicated back and forth here, this dialogue. And so, in those verses, so they go and they tell Mordecai what Esther had said. And then, in verse 12, and they told to Mordecai Esther's words. Now, verse 13, then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, and saying, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. Now, he's reminding her this, that on the 13th day of the 12th month, when this decree is start to be being executed, so don't think that you're going to be safe because you're in the king's house. Because This is spiritual warfare here. And remember, the same thing happening to us today, that when he says that, don't think that you're going to escape. See, that's a spiritual aspect to this. Because, see, here's what's happening in our culture today, that the enemy, his ultimate goal is to destroy us physically. But if he can destroy us physically, he wants to destroy us spiritually. In that, he wants to destroy our trust, he wants to destroy our credibility, and he wants to destroy our testimony. And when we look back over the last year, over the last year and a half, with all that has taken place, with the pandemics, with the shut-in, with the elections, and with the vaccinations, all these things, as a result of these things, see, a lot of trust has been destroyed. A lot of credibility has been destroyed. A lot of testimony has been destroyed. And when this happens, it's going to be a long road back. And this is something that we, as reality, that we got to deal with this thing now. It has happened. Credibility has been destroyed. Trust has been destroyed. And so now it's a long road back to get back to where we were pre-pandemic. And so don't think that because we just going along and we see all this that's taking place and we just going along with it and thinking that we're going to escape, that there's not going to be no fallout from this stuff. This is reality, and we see it every day. Okay, because it says, ultimately goal, remember, if he can destroy you physically, he will destroy you spiritually. This is spiritual warfare. And it's just amazing how God uses Esther, a woman, to teach us some very valuable principles here about faith, about love, about sound mind. And then notice how he responds here in verse 14 also. He said, for if thou altogether hold thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement, which that word enlargement really means relief, and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And so now notice that this is godly advice here. And notice how Mordecai's faith here, because he's telling her that if you keep silent at this time, then God will use someone else to deliver them. But for you, it may be too late, because once on the 13th day of the 12th month, when this decree is start taking place, he said, like, it may be too late for you. But he has no doubt that God's going to deliver his people. It's sort of like when in Genesis with Joseph, how his family sold him into slavery, and they meant it for evil, but he told them, no, God meant it for good. So there's no doubt that deliverance will come from another place. But there's something else here that for us that we can learn from this, and that is that if we keep silent in the face of all this unrighteousness, all this ungodliness, unholiness, injustice, then God will deliver, then God will raise up people, a deliverer from another source, from another people. And we don't get to choose who God uses. Remember in Luke 19, verse 40, when Jesus came into Jerusalem and all the people were singing and praising God, and the Pharisees tell Jesus, tell his disciples to keep silent, and Jesus tell them, if they keep silence, the rocks will cry out. Well, that's the same thing that's happening today, because the people of God has gone silent in the face of unrighteousness, injustice, unholiness, and now God is using people from an unlikely source, from an unlikely place, and they are crying out. These are the rocks crying out because we did. And so, because we did, and remember, we don't get to choose who God used. This is spiritual warfare. I mean, they're teaching us a valuable lesson here. And notice how he ends this verse in 14, and it says, and who knoweth whether thou art coming to the kingdom for such a time as this. Notice what he's saying here now. He made no guarantees here. He gives no assurances here. He simply says, who knoweth? See, too many times we kind of, a little bit too loosely with telling people, promising people things that just do this, God's going to take care of you. Better keep in mind, what God has for you is for you. What God has for me is for me. I can't promise you what God does for me, he's going to do for you. We need to be careful when we, make those assumptions like that. And so, because I remember now, there are times when God has actually gave people assurances, when God actually has gave people some guarantees, but not in this case right here. He just simply say that who knoweth whether thou art coming to the kingdom for such a time as this. And so we have to be careful making promises that God has not told us to make. That's why it's so important that we get understanding, that we get the facts, that we get godly advice, and we use spiritual discernment. Because just because someone attached God's name in it, that doesn't make it authentic. Remember in 2 Corinthians, and it was not true, then Paul would not have warned us of this. Remember in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 14 and 15, and he tells us that beware that Satan would disguise himself as an angel of light, and that his servants would also do the same. So just because they attach God's name to it, that doesn't mean that God is in it. That doesn't make it authentic. So we have to be aware that this is spiritual warfare, and God is, and just a beautiful example how God is using them to illustrate to us how we should conduct ourselves when we find ourselves in situations that appears to be helpless and hopeless. But it's giving us a great illustration here with this dialogue that's going on between Esther and Mordecai, how actually they are building each other's faith. And look at verse 15. And then Esther bade them return to Mordecai this answer. And so now notice now, she's going to respond back to Mordecai. This dialogue is continuing. And so now Esther, having her faith, has been strengthened by getting understanding, by getting facts, by godly advice, spiritual discernment. And now notice how she responds in verse 16. Go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye from me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise. And so I will go in unto the king, which is not according to the law. If I perish, I perish. Now, this is just a wonderful, wonderful illustration of how we should conduct ourselves, because, like I said, there's no guarantees here. This is just genuine faith here. Because now, like I said, there are times when God had actually gave people guarantees. He gave people assurance. But notice in this lesson to Esther, you don't see this phrase, and the word of the Lord came to Esther. You don't see this phrase, and the Lord sent someone to Esther to deliver a message. You don't see this phrase where the Lord said unto Esther, go up, I have delivered them into your hand. No, you don't see that. This is genuine faith and genuine trust. And so bear in mind, this is a wonderful illustration for us that we can learn from this, that how we need to conduct ourselves, that we are not immune to the reality. We're not immune to the laws of society. So Esther's fears, they were real, but it's an illustration how you to increase, to grow in your faith by getting godly advice. And because now remember now, like I said, there was no assurance here, but there have been times when he does. Remember in Daniel chapter 3, 16, 18, with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and when they was thrown into the fire furnace because they refused to bow down to King Nebuchadnezzar's golden calf, and they told him that, O king, even our God is able to deliver us. Even if he doesn't, we still will not bow down to your calf. And so like that, just genuine faith, genuine trust with no assurances here. And that's what he wants us to get to that point. That's what he's teaching us. And he's using Esther here to teach us a valuable lesson here. And why that's so important? Because we walk by faith. And God says it's easy to walk when you have that assurance to step out there. But when you don't have those assurance, are you going to trust God then? That's when you see what he's trying to teach us, that fears are real, but you overcome fears by trusting God. And so now notice in verse 17, and so Mordecai, and so she said, and that's why she said, if I perish, I perish. There's genuine faith there. In verse 17, so Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. Now, think about Proverbs 27:17. You know this proverb where iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. This is just a beautiful example between Esther and Mordecai, how you build, how people of God can really increase each other's faith. Because remember, Esther began in fear, indicting. She ended courageous and bold. Mordecai began in sackcloth and mourning. He ended fasting and prayer. This is just a beautiful example of how one sharpens another. Each other has been strengthened by the other, and that's why this is a beautiful example of how iron sharpens iron. Okay, and then so in chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, now it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house, and the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house, over against the gate of the house. Now all that means that the king sat facing the door like I'm here now. He could see anyone coming into his palace, and it was up to him whether or not he was going to show them favor. And then verse 2, and it was so, when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. Now, what we see here in this story with Esther is saying, you see, like, courageous faith in spite of fear. She did a courageous faith in spite of fear. And so, in spite of not having no assurance, no having no guarantees, she was still willing to put it all on the line for her people. And you know why she did it? For the love of her people. And these are the exact same people that God said were stubborn, stiff-necked, rebellious, unfaithful. But yet, she put it all on the line for the love of her people. And what we're seeing here in this is this. All people have their issues. Our people have their issues. But still, love your people. And because our people have a rich heritage, God has used our people to accomplish some great and marvelous things. In spite of all the stuff that we do, God still loves us. Esther put it all on the line for the love of our people. And remember, we all was in that situation where we was helpless and hopeless. We owed a sin debt that we simply could not pay. And Christ paid that sin debt for us. And nobody did it. He did it for love. It's not because that we was loving, because we was righteous, and because we was holy. He did it for love. And God is using Esther here today to teach us a valuable lesson. And it's all about getting in any and every situation, get understanding, get the facts, get godly advice, and use spiritual discernment. See, notice how in 2 Timothy 1 verse 7, all this sums up this lesson today when it says, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but a spirit of power and of love and a sound mind. All these things are working together, and God is using Esther as an illustration for us to see how in these situations when we feel we helpless and hopeless, how we should conduct ourselves. We reach out to other spiritual brothers. We get the facts. We get understanding. We use spiritual discernment. God don't want us just doing the stuff blindly. God wants us to walk by faith, realizing that even in the midst of all this, we still are not immune to reality and the consequences of reality. We walk by faith. That concludes our lesson for today, and I want to thank all of you in the sanctuary, and thank all of you watching by way of social media, and wishing you all a wonderful and blessed day. Thank you.